My name is Jeremy. I'm one of the pastors here. If you're newer with us, it's a good time to be new because we are working through a new book, the book of Ruth, and we are starting Advent. It's kind of why we're lighting these Advent candles. The first candle represents the first week of Advent, which is hope. Now you're saying, okay, what exactly is Advent? Well, I think you could kind of summarize, kind of boil Advent down really into kind of one feeling or one word, and that is the word anticipation. And I don't think there's any better time than Christmas time to kind of conjure up those feelings of anticipation, especially as you think about, maybe flash back to when you were a kid and those weeks leading up to Christmas and that feeling of anticipation that you got because you were excited about some particular gift that you were going to get. Let me go back circa 1992 to when I was in deep anticipation for what I thought was, at that point, the greatest gift that had ever been created. That was the gift Hungry Hungry Hippos, okay? Hungry Hungry Hippos was the game where, in order to win, you just smashed down on a lever that was protruding out the back of a hippopotamus, and you just smashed as hard as you could to try to get all the marbles into your little pocket, and you won. All right, it led to so many fights in my house as a kid. It was incredible, best gift ever. And I just remember that time leading up to Christmas. All I thought about was Hungry Hungry Hippos. All I wanted, all I thought about, all I asked for. The anticipation was killing me. Now, I want you to just kind of do a little thought experiment. Go back to a time when you kind of had that Hungry Hungry Hippo moment in your life. Like all of us, we sense that feeling of anticipation. In this time of year, I think it kind of comes back up a little bit more viscerally in our mind. We can think about that feeling of anticipation. That's in a lot of ways what Christmas does. It gives us that sense of anticipation. But here's the thing about Christmas. This is what we're going to really unpack over these next 4 weeks, and this is really what Advent is about. The anticipation that Christmas gives us is not simply the anticipation for some fleeting toy. It's not the anticipation for something like a new car or a new video game. As fun as those are, the anticipation that really drives at the Christmas season is a soul-level anticipation. It's the anticipation that we have of remembering that God has sent himself, that God sent Jesus, his son, the promised king. But it's also the anticipation that Jesus has come and he's also coming back. And so Advent is a reminder that God has come, but it also reminds us that God is coming back to redeem and to rescue us once and for all. And so in order for us to embrace this Advent season, what we're going to do is we're going to go and plop ourselves here into this Old Testament book, this small Old Testament book, the book of Ruth, because I think the book of Ruth, in many ways, it captures this feeling of anticipation. And what you see is it comes at a time when the Israelites were anticipating the promise of a king. God had promised to give the Israelites a king. And so the Israelites are waiting for this king, and yet it also comes at a time during this waiting period where many people had forgotten about God. In fact, the book right before Ruth, the book of Judges, it ends on a very ominous note. The book of Judges ends in this way. It says this in Judges 21:25. In those days, there was no king in Israel, and everyone did what was right in his own eyes. This is the setting that the book of Ruth takes place in. It's a setting where immorality is flourishing, where darkness is pervading the land, where essentially hopelessness abounds. And yet, in the midst of that ominous setting, what we are going to see is that God is at work through a seemingly mundane and ordinary situation. Through two essentially insignificant women, God is at work fulfilling his plan to redeem his people. And so on the one hand, yes, Ruth, as we see here in Ruth 1, Ruth looks like a Shakespearean tragedy because it begins with death. But as we're going to see, even when all hope seems lost, God is still at work. That's what we're going to see in the book of Ruth. Even in the bleakest of moments, even when it really is so difficult to see, God is still at work. And so yes, the story of Ruth may start with a tragedy. It may start with tragedy and death, but it ultimately ends with joy and life, with birth. And so the big idea for Ruth chapter 1, it really kind of kicks us off in understanding what the book of Ruth about is simply this: God is still working when it seems least likely that he is at work. God is still working even when you look out at the scope of your life and you're like, I'm not really sure that I believe that. It doesn't seem like God is at work. What we're going to see through the book of Ruth is that God indeed is still working. Now, back in the 1700s, there was a fear that began to creep up, and it was a fear that became known as taphophobia. Taphophobia hadn't really existed up until that point, but taphophobia was the fear of being buried alive, okay? And what happened in the 1700s, towards the late 1700s, is, doctors, they had a hard time telling the difference between someone who was dead, someone who was in a coma, someone who had paralysis. And so as a result, what ended up happening is that oftentimes doctors or even family members, they would pronounce somebody dead because they didn't see any signs of life, and they would go ahead and bury that person. Could you imagine going home from church on a Sunday and being really excited to take a nap, and you just take the most epic nap of your life only to wake up buried in a box 6 feet under? Like, that's a bad day, Like, that's, it's like you're sleeping so hard that your family members think you're dead. And they're like, well, he's dead. We're going to throw him in a box and bury him, That's what was happening in the 1700s. And as a result, you have all of these people that were deathly afraid, pun intended, of going to sleep or anything bad happening to them. In fact, Edgar Allan Poe, it was such a big thing in that time that famed author Edgar Allan Poe, he wrote a work called The Premature Burial. It was a very big deal at that time. Well, now doctors eventually, they began to realize that just because you couldn't see or just because you couldn't observe life, it didn't mean that it didn't exist. That maybe that person, maybe they were just taking a nap. And so they entered the safety coffin. So what ended up happening was they developed a coffin whereby you had a hole in it, and you would actually have a string tied to your finger that ran up to the surface, and just in case you woke up from that coma that you were in and you realized you were buried alive, you could just kind of dangle it, and it was supposed to ring a bell above, and someone was like, oh my gosh, they're buried there, and we're supposed to dig them back up again. That was the idea there. But what doctors were realizing was, hey, just because we look at somebody and based on our limited information, just because we think that they're dead, that doesn't mean that life doesn't still exist. Now, thankfully, we don't have to worry so much anymore about being buried alive, okay? But, listen to this, when it comes to our faith and to God's work in our life, I think many of us have had those moments where we can't see any progress. Here's what I mean with that. I think just like an 18th century doctor who can't find a pulse on a person, I think there are times in our life where we can't see the pulse of God in our life. And so what we do is we look out and we observe and we think, man, is God really still working? I can't see it. I mean, how many of us have ever had these thoughts run through our mind? God, where are you? Where are you, God? God, what are you up to right now? God, are you even real? God, what is happening in my life? Why is all this stuff happening? What are you doing? And chances are that pretty much every single one of us, to one degree or another, has had those thoughts, whether you've been a Christian for 1 month or whether you've been a Christian for 10 years. Those thoughts run through our mind, and this is the situation that we find ourselves in here in the first chapter of Ruth. And so if you have ever wondered or if you have ever struggled to see God's work in your life, then the book of Ruth is going to speak loudly and clearly to you. And it's going to remind us that God is still working, even when it seems least likely that he's at work. That's the reminder here. So what I want to do is I want to walk through Ruth chapter 1. I essentially want to look at Naomi's situation And then I want to look at Ruth's loyalty. So this is kind of the two main characters that we see at the outset of the book of Ruth. So let's look at Naomi's situation, and then let's look at Ruth's loyalty. And then we're going to end by looking at this glimpse of hope, this glimmer of hope that we see, and connecting that to the Christmas season here. All right, so Naomi's situation, Ruth's loyalty, and then a glimmer of hope. Look back at verse 1. Verse 1, it says, in the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land. And a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab. Now, Moab was not a part of Israel. In fact, Moab, in a lot of ways, was Israel's enemy. And so you know it had to be pretty bad of a famine for an Israelite to go into enemy territory in order to seek provision. It says he and his wife had 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, the name of his wife Naomi. The names of the 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion, and they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. There's actually a lot of interesting play on words here. The word Bethlehem, now that should trigger our mind because we're like, I've heard of Bethlehem before. But the word Bethlehem, it literally means house of bread. So it's a play on words when in the house of bread, they can't find any bread because of a famine. And so it says that they were Ephrathites from the Bethlehem in Judah, and they went into the country of Moab, and they remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives. The name of the one, not Orpah, okay? All week my computer wanted to change it to Oprah. I'm like, no, it's Orpah. And the name of the other was Ruth. They lived there about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left with her 2 sons and her husband. There were none. All right, so the first thing we see is Naomi's situation here. The situation, again, it is a very ominous start to the book. So let's just think about it here. We already talked about how in the day of Judges, there was a ton of immorality. So the context that Naomi finds herself in is there's a lot of spiritual depravity. But then also it says that there's a famine. So not only is there spiritual depravity, there's physical depravity. They can't get the food that they need. And then not only that, her husband dies and her 2 sons die. And so of course she has the emotional and the mental toll. But the other thing that it takes a toll on is her socially. Because what that means is as a woman left without a husband, left without a son, in those days you were socially deprived. So here is Naomi. At the start of this book, she is both, there's a spiritual depravity, there's a physical depravity, and there's a social depravity. You're like, how could it get any worse? Like this is a total bad to worse type situation. If it can go wrong, it will go wrong. It reminds me of one of the best Christmas movies ever, right? Home Alone, the original. You think about Harry and Marv? You know, it's like Harry and Marv, and that's in the movies. It's like if it can go wrong to Harry and Marv, it will go wrong. It's like every single thing is stacked up against them in that movie. You're reading through these first few verses in the book of Ruth, and you're like, okay, if it can go wrong, it's going to go wrong. What else could possibly happen? In fact, even the names themselves give us an indication of how bad things were. So Elimelech, his name actually meant, my God is king. Naomi's name means pleasant. Mahlon's name means sickness. And Chilion's name means wasting. All right? So if you're ever upset about what your name means, just remember, your name probably doesn't mean sickness or wasting, okay? All right? So that's what's happening. There's this progression in their life where they are in such a desperate situation that they even name their children to signify how bad their situation is. So we get to verse 5, and we're like wondering, how in any way how is this going to be worked out? Like, is there any possible way that this situation can get worked out? I mean, all hope seems lost. Eventually, it leads Naomi to this conclusion. Look over at verse 20. What does she say? She says, do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. That's what that word means. It means bitter. I went away full. The Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me? I think here's what we begin to learn from Naomi's situation here. What we begin to learn is that bitterness, oftentimes it blinds us to the work of God in our life. Bitterness creeps into our life, and it begins to make it difficult for us to see the work of God in our life. Think of it like when you come out to your car in the morning, very much like you probably did today, and there's frost or ice on the windshield. If you're like me, and you're running usually late, you come out and you're like, oh, I got to scrape the windshield. So what do you end up doing? You turn the car on, you put the frost on, and then you scrape the least amount possible for you to safely drive down the road, So you scrape that little window, and so for the first 5 minutes, you're driving like this, You're just trying so desperately to see through this little tiny window. And so when we're driving and the windshield is frosted over like that, it makes it difficult to see what's out in front of you. That's what bitterness does in our life. Bitterness blinds us to seeing what God is doing. I think, particularly here from the story of Ruth, I think you see bitterness kind of coming on in our life because of one of two different things: misery and mundane. Two different types of circumstances, I think, in our life oftentimes breed that type of bitterness. Miserable circumstances and the mundane. So let's unpack those for just a second, because I think you see those here in the first chapter of Ruth. So let's talk about misery. I want to throw a slide up here because I think this is what you see here, Ruth kind of helping us to understand in the Christian life. I think in the book of Ruth, Naomi's circumstances in some ways kind of capture the tension that we feel in the faith journey as a Christian. So in the faith journey of a Christian, essentially what we're trying to do is we're trying to kind of hold three things in tension. And you see Naomi doing this in the first chapter. You're holding God's sovereignty, meaning God is in control of all things. You're holding that in tension with the goodness of God, but then you're holding it in tension with the fact that life is difficult and bad things happen. And so right there in the middle is the sweet spot of saying that all of those exist together, and the faith journey for the Christian is being able to hold those in the middle without letting one of those pull you in one direction or the other. Specifically, without letting life's difficulties pull you down to miss God's sovereignty and His goodness. Well, let's keep that slide up there for a second. Let's walk through these just to see how this plays out in Naomi's life. So think about the sovereignty of God. The fact that God is in control of all things. The Bible is so clear about that. Naomi understands. You see in her language here, she understands that God has governed every part of her life. As part of the mercy mystery that we see in the book of Ruth is that Naomi attributes all of these things to the hand of God. If God is in control of all things, then He's certainly in control of what has happened to her here. I think one of the best places that you see this is you see this in the book of Job. You go a few books later in the Old Testament, and there's this guy named Job who is a righteous man, the Bible says, and yet Job is afflicted by Satan. But even in the midst of his terrible affliction, here's what Job says. Right at the outset, Job says in Job 1:21, he says, "Naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked shall I return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away." God gives life, God gives death, and He's in control of everything in between. Job says, "Blessed be the name of the Lord." So we hold God's sovereignty on the one hand, but we also hold the goodness of God. You know something about Naomi here? One of the things about Naomi is, yes, she attributes these events of her life to God, but you know what Naomi doesn't do? Naomi doesn't abandon God. What Naomi doesn't do is say, hey, God has done these things, therefore I will not believe in God. No, Naomi says, look, God is in control, but He's also good, and so even though I don't understand what He's doing, I'm not going to abandon Him. And so she holds up the goodness of God even when she can't see it. But then also we have to just acknowledge that we live on this side of eternity where sin reigns, and as a result of that, we have difficulties in life. Those difficulties range from everything from a cancer diagnosis to a child who walks away from the faith to someone who dies prematurely as a young person to sin struggles in our life. We hold all of these life difficulties together, and the struggle for the Christian is to live in the middle of all of that and to know that all three of those things are all true. To live in the misery, the difficulty of those circumstances. So what do we do? What do we do when we're facing down the difficulties of life and those circumstances like Naomi finds here? Well, I think what you see in Naomi's life is that in the midst of her difficulties, what she does is she starts from what she knows to be true and she works from there. So you see in verse 20, what Naomi does is she refers to God the Almighty. The Hebrew word there is El Shaddai. And so even though Naomi is upset about her circumstances, she refers to El Shaddai, which means that God is the mighty one, that God is the one who is more than enough, that God is the all-sufficient one. What Naomi is doing is she is working for what she knows to be true about God, working off of that into what she doesn't know about her circumstances. Working from the known and allowing that to inform the unknown. And you think about it this way. It's like how a good doctor gives a diagnosis. Okay, now, I'm not a doctor, nor do I play one on TV. But I have a friend who's a doctor, so I think that makes me an expert. And so, a doctor, let's just say you walk into the doctor's office and you tell the doctor that your arm hurts. You're like, I have pain in my arm, right? No good doctor is going to say, I'm not really sure what that is. It's probably gangrene, and so let's just chop it off, Like, that's not how doctors diagnose things, right? They don't work from the unknown and just make, crazy claims on that. No, they begin to do tests and they begin to dive in and say, okay, what do we know about your pain? What do we know about this situation? And let's go with what is known and then work into what is unknown. So you can think of it this way. In times of difficulty, we need to let what's true about God dictate our circumstances instead of letting our circumstances determine what is true about God. Does that make sense? Let that just sit on you for a second. In difficult situations in your life, when misery creeps up, we need to let what is true about God, who we know him to be, in control, sovereign and good. We need to let that control our circumstances, determine our circumstances, instead of the other way around. I was reading a book this week by a Christian psychologist named David Benner, and I stumbled across this, and I thought, wow, this is very apt for what we see happening in the life of Naomi here. And here's what Benner says. He says, it is relatively easy to meet God in moments of joy or bliss. In these situations, we correctly count ourselves blessed by God. The challenge is to believe that this is also true and to know God's presence in the midst of doubt, depression, anxiety, conflict, or failure. He says this, but the God who is Emmanuel is equally in those moments that we would never choose as in those that we would always gladly choose. The truth is that God is to be found in all things, even and most especially in the painful, tragic, and unpleasant things. That's the God that we serve. And so we see that bitterness can creep into our life when the misery of life's difficulties and circumstances comes in. But I think another way that you see that creep in, that bitterness is bred in our life, is just through the mundane circumstances of our life. Well, what you're going to see in the book of Ruth is we kind of just take a step back, is you're going to see that in the book of Ruth, it's just kind of a normal story. Like we just came out of, the book of, right before this Judges and then Joshua, and there's all these extravagant things that God is doing, all these extraordinary things. And the book of Ruth is just kind of a book about a couple people and going through a bad time. And it's just a very normal book. There's nothing fanciful or nothing really even extraordinary about it. The reason I think this is so important for us to key in on is because every single one of us, most of our lives are lived within the mundane rhythm of the ordinary life. Like Ruth is more true of all of our lives than most other books of the Bible in the sense that it's just kind of a normal story. And I think we need to see that. I think most of us, what we need is we don't need courage for the extraordinary. I think oftentimes what we need is we need courage for the everyday. Just courage to get up and go after the normal, everyday things that we face in our life. Tish Harrison Warren, she's an author. She wrote a book called Liturgy of the Ordinary. I think it's just one of the most profound books for, I think, the everyday Christian. And what she says in Liturgy of the Ordinary is she says this, small bits of our day are profoundly meaningful because they are the site of our worship. Listen to this. The crucible of our formation is in the monotony of our daily routines. I think here's why we struggle with this, and I think oftentimes we become bitter with the mundane. I think the reason we struggle is because we measure success in our life, Christian success, kind of by the big and the extraordinary, not by the minute and everyday. And so we kind of measure the success of our Christian life by like the camp experience. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but that is not the standard that we should be measuring the success of our Christian life. These big, flashy moments. Oftentimes, God is at work in those small details. And so I think sometimes we can get tripped up by thinking that in order for something to count, it's got that, we got to go big or go home mentality. I stumbled across this article recently in the work The Onion. Now, if you don't know The Onion, okay, it's a satire. It's sarcastic. All right, so you got to understand, right? What I'm about to read is sarcasm. All right, because if you don't understand that, you're going to miss the whole thing. But it talked about the title of the article. The title of the article was "Unambitious Loser with Happy Fulfilling Life Still Lives in Hometown." So the article goes on to say, longtime acquaintances confirmed to reporters this week that local man Michael Husmer, an unambitious 29-year-old loser who leads an enjoyable and fulfilling life, still lives in his hometown, and he has no desire to leave. The article goes on to say, former classmates also confirmed that the underachiever is apparently resigned to going to his little, small-time, stable, extremely fulfilling job in town each day and has zero ambitions to leave his position and pursue a more prestigious and soul-crushing career path in the real city. It says, according to relatives who moved thousands of miles away and are currently alienated from much of the family, Husmer has never once taken a major professional or financial risk, choosing instead to, quote, coast through life by putting considerable time and effort into his rewarding marriage, playing an active role in his two children's lives, and being sincerely thankful for what he has in this world. The reason that that's funny is because so much of our life we base on the big and the extraordinary, not the minute and the ordinary. Leon Morris, commentator, talking about the book of Ruth, he says this: God works in the lives of seemingly unimportant people and seemingly unimportant matters in very important ways. Here's what that means for your life. What that means for your life is that God is using you and shaping you just as much when you are awake at 3 a.m. taking care of a sick child as if you were in overseas in Nepal witnessing to a remote tribe in the mountains. But God He desires to use you more or less, probably more so in the diapers and the dishes of life than in those extraordinary ways. The question is, do we believe that? Do we believe that God is shaping us in the mundane and the everyday, or do we just measure it simply by the big and the fanciful? God is at work in the mundane, and here's the thing: if you don't understand how God is working in the mundane things of your life, listen to me, this is a warning. You will go through life and you will miss most of the ways which God is working in your life. What ends up happening is when we miss it, bitterness creeps in and we begin to struggle to see how God is at work in our life. So Naomi's situation really begs the question, can I trust God with the circumstances of my life? Like all of them. When misery comes in, when the mundane of life comes, can I trust God with the circumstances of my life? That's Naomi's situation. But let's look at Ruth's loyalty. Verse 6, it says, then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. And so she set out from the place where she was with her two daughters-in-law, and they went on the way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her two daughters, go return each of you to her mother's house, and may the Lord deal kindly with you as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you in your own house of her husband. Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices, and they wept. The second thing we see here, as we see with Ruth, we see her loyalty. Ruth's loyalty. Word gets back to Naomi that the famine is over. And so we begin to see in the book of Ruth, God's grace start to emerge more visibly here. And as Naomi heads back to Bethlehem, what she tries to do is she tries to convince Orpah and Ruth to stay. She's trying to tell them that it's not worth it, that it won't be easy for them. And for a second, it seems like, no, both of the women, they're going to go with her. But then Naomi kind of doubles down on it. Look what she says in verse 11. But Naomi said, no, turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. And then they lifted up their voices and they wept again. And here's the difference. And Orpah kissed her mother-in-law and she went back. But Ruth clung to her. I think two things emerge here when you see Ruth's loyalty. I think first, you see the cost of following. But then I think also in Ruth's loyalty, more importantly, you see the character of God coming forth. So let's talk about those real quick. Let's talk about the cost of following. Notice how hard Naomi tries to convince her daughters-in-law to leave her. Like she's like, this is not going to go well. You should not stay. It kind of reminds me of like kind of those elite military training programs. You know, where you know, the goal of the elite military training program is not to get people in. In a lot of ways, it's to keep people out. And so they're like, it's going to be really bad. Like, it's going to be awful. So you probably just don't want to do this, okay? And I went on, one of my favorites, I've actually read several books on this and watched a lot of documentaries, kind of fascinated by the U.S. military, the Navy SEALs. And you go on the Navy SEALs website, and this is what it says. It describes kind of that first week of their elite special training. And it says this. It says in the first week, it consists of 5.5 days of cold, wet, brutally difficult operational training on fewer than 4 hours of sleep. This week tests physical endurance, mental toughness, pain, cold tolerance, teamwork, attitude, and your ability to perform work under high physical and mental stress and sleep deprivation. Above all, it tests determination and desire. On average, only 25% of SEAL candidates make it through this week. Basically, hey, you probably shouldn't do this. Like, no thanks. This is what Naomi is doing to Ruth. She's saying, look, it's going to be difficult. I don't think she come. Naomi, in essence, you know what she's doing? She's kind of doing what Jesus did with his disciples hundreds of years later. Remember what Jesus said in Luke chapter 14 as he has all these people flocked around him that want to follow him? Jesus says this in Luke 14. He says, if anyone comes to me and does not hate his own father and mother and wife and children and brothers and sisters, yes, even his own life, he cannot be my disciple. Jesus says, whoever does not bear his own cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. What Naomi recognizes is she recognizes that Ruth is, one, she is a Moabite. Moabite, remember we said that they're the enemies of Israel, and so she's like, hey, this is not going to go well. People aren't going to like you. You're not going to be winning any friend competitions back in Israel. So she's a Moabite, but not only that, she's a woman, and we said that women in that day, their status wasn't very great, but not only was she a woman, she was a widow. Her prospects were completely decimated. And so Naomi is pointing out these realities of following her, and she's saying, hey, it is going to be very, very difficult. And yet Ruth chooses to do it anyway. What Ruth reminds us of here, she chooses what essentially Jesus would call the narrow road. Jesus said, in order to follow him in Matthew 7, you must enter by the narrow gate. For the gate is wide and the way is easy that leads to destruction. And those who enter by it are many. For the gate is narrow and the way is hard that leads to life. And those who find it are few. So one of the first things that we see Ruth's loyalty reminding us of here is that Ruth's loyalty reminds us of this central truth of following Jesus. That the call of following Jesus is a costly thing. But not only that, I think maybe more importantly, what we see in Ruth's loyalty here is it reminds us of the character of God. Look at verse 15. It says, and she said, see, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said, and this is so important, this is one of the major keys to the story, do not urge me to leave or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people. And then listen, what does she say? And your God will be my God. Where you die, I will die. and there I will be buried. And may the Lord do so to me and more also, if anything but death parts me from you. This is essentially Ruth's conversion. This is her camp experience. This is her walking down the aisle of church and giving her life over to God. And what begins to emerge ever so slowly in this story of Ruth is how God is at work in the most unlikely of ways. Because what you see here is Ruth's enduring commitment to Naomi. What it really is doing is it's reminding us of God's enduring commitment to you and me. Ruth's loyalty to Naomi really is reminding us of God's ongoing loyalty to you and me. In Genesis chapter 12, God makes a promise. All the way back in Genesis, God promises to this guy named Abraham. He makes this covenant with him. And he says to Abraham that you, as this special family, you will be a blessing to all nations. And he gives that promise back in Genesis chapter 12. And then you fast forward to Ruth, who is an outsider. She's not an Israelite. And what you realize is that right here in Ruth, she plays a pivotal role in God fulfilling the Abrahamic covenant to bring the good news of himself to all peoples. Ruth is playing a central role in that. Ruth is an outsider, and now God is making her an insider. Yes, Ruth is loyal to Naomi, but more importantly, what we see is that God's loyalty to his people and to all peoples is shining forth. And here's the even crazier thing. The crazier thing is that it was through Ruth's confession, listen to this, that God, he would bring about his promise of a Messiah. Here's the thing, this is a spoiler alert, okay? You still have to come back in a few weeks, but at the end of the book of Ruth, it ends with a genealogy. You're like, that's weird. Why would the book end with a genealogy? What's fascinating is the book of Ruth ends with a genealogy. The book of Matthew, the Gospel of Matthew, when Jesus is on the scene, it begins with a genealogy. And what you realize is that Ruth's genealogy is Jesus' genealogy. That God is using Ruth in his plan to bring about his promised Messiah. The story of Ruth is reminding us that in the most unexpected of ways and using the most insignificant people, God is bringing about his greatest work. So what Ruth does is Ruth essentially gives us a bird's eye view as to what God is doing. Think about this. You and I, what we have is we have the 30,000 foot view as to what God is doing in the story of Ruth. And that's not how Naomi and Ruth see it. Naomi and Ruth are on the ground level. It's hard for them to see what God is doing. But you and I have the bird's eye view. We can see that God, even in the midst of this tragedy, God is still at work. He's still doing a good thing. That is what the gospel is in our life. The gospel in our life is the bird's eye view that pulls us up and out of the misery and the mundane of our circumstances to see that God has been, is, and always will be at work in our life. That's the good news of the gospel. Essentially what it is, years ago we used to kind of fairly regularly, we would go to a corn maze every fall. And so we would bring the family to a corn maze because we thought, hey, what better way to enjoy fall than bringing your family to the site of every horror movie that ever exists? And so we would go to this corn maze, and you're walking through. Well, what they had was at different spots in the corn maze, they would build these towers that you could walk up into, right? So instead of laying in the fetal position crying because you're lost in the back of the corn maze, you could go to the tower, climb up, and you could see, oh, okay, there's the end over there. This is where we are. We can work our way through, okay? So the tower gave you perspective. Because when you're down on the ground and all the corn's around you, you can't see anything. So what you have to do is you kind of have to elevate yourself up. We see one of these towers right here, one of these lookout towers in verse 22. This is how the chapter ends. And this is how we'll end our time today. Look at verse 22. It says, so Naomi returned. And Ruth, the Moabite, her daughter-in-law with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem. This is the little phrase right here, at the beginning of barley harvest. This is one of those lookout towers where we're on the ground and it's hard to see what God is doing, but this gives us a little bit of perspective. What this does is essentially it's a glimmer of hope. And so the end of the book, or end of chapter 1 of Ruth, essentially is saying it just so happened that they returned to Bethlehem at the time of barley harvest. And what you see, and what you're going to begin to see over the next couple of weeks, is that no detail is insignificant in God's providence. What that means in your life is that there's no such thing as a it just so happened instance. There's no such thing as that. There's no such thing in your life as it just so happened that I was at the store with the person who I wanted to invite to church. Or it just so happened that I received an encouraging phone call on a really tough day. Or it just so happened that I got that job interview that I didn't think were possible. Those it just so happened moments, what they are in our life is they are breadcrumbs along the way of our life, reminding us that God is always at work. Even if it doesn't seem like it. It's behind the scenes. This, in a lot of ways, I think is what the first week of Advent is all about. It's about hope. That's what Advent is about. The first week, we light the first candle. The first candle represents hope. Because the truth is that many, many years later, well after Ruth's time had passed, Ruth and the Israelites, they were still waiting. They were still anticipating. In fact, the time between when the last Old Testament book was written and by the time Jesus showed up on the scenes, it was several hundred years. So for hundreds of years, there was silence. You got to think, right? If you're an Israelite, you're like, man, this promise of a Messiah, this promise that we have, like, what is going on? You got to think that in the midst of this silence, they were saying, God, what are you doing? Like, God, are you still there? God, do you care about us? And then Paul reminds us of this very clearly in Galatians chapter 4. Paul says, but when the fullness of time had come, at just the right time, God sent forth his son, born of a woman, born under the law, to redeem those who were under the law so that we might receive adoption as sons. The book of Ruth shows us that in the worst of times, the period of the judges, God was working in a seemingly insignificant family to redeem his people in a very unlikely way. Think about Christmas. You think about the parallels to the Christmas story. Christmas reminds us that when all hope seemed to be lost, God redeemed his people. God redeemed us through an insignificant virgin woman in a very unexpected way. God redeemed the world through a baby. A baby. That's the story of God, that when it seems like God is not at work, he is doing some of his best work. So let me ask you, do you believe that God is working in your life? Like today. Do you believe that God is working in your life? Are you having trouble today seeing that God is at work, whether it's in the misery of your circumstances or the mundane of your circumstances? Because if you are, and we look to Ruth and we look to the gospel to remind ourselves that God has indeed sent his promised king. What Isaiah 9 says about us is true when it says that the people walked in darkness, they have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given. Let's pray. Father, we thank you for what this season not only means to us, but the implications for our life. Father, it truly changes everything that you dwelt among us, Emmanuel. And God, we can have hope. We can know for sure that you are working in any and every circumstance in our life, even when we can't see it. So Lord, would you help us to believe it? Would you help us to believe that that is true? And we ask this in the name of Jesus. Amen.